The former general counsel of the CIA, Lawrence R. Houston, concurred in this judgment. It should, he said, be used only as a, quote, last resort, end quote. Footnote 84. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 84. Houston, January 15, 76, page 5. Resuming the reading. The chief of CCS noted that these operations are run for specific purposes, unrelated to profit, and that, quote, I am not in the business to make money, end quote. Footnote 85. Footnote 85. Chief CCS, January 27, 76, page 80. Resuming the reading. Only two proprietaries, the insurance complex and Air America, returned continuing profits or did large volumes of business. For this reason, the committee sought to discover if the CIA would ever again seek to establish a large proprietary conglomerate, such as the Air America complex. The chief CCS responded in this manner. These kind of facilities, any kind of facility of this kind, get established and are used because they are needed in the pursuit of an existing operational requirement. If such an operational requirement should again arise, I would assume that the agency would consider setting up a large-scale air proprietary with one proviso that we have a chance at keeping it secret that it is CIA. Footnote 86. Reading footnote 86. IBID page 21. Resuming the reading. Mr. Houston noted that he did not believe it was possible to keep such an activity secret. I'll answer to that. I don't believe it's possible. The aviation industry, everybody knows what everybody is doing, and something new coming along is immediately the focus of thousands of eyes and prying questions. And that, combined with the intricacies of a corporate administration these days and the checks and balances, I think make a large aviation proprietary probably impossible. I don't think you can do a real cover operation, is my personal assessment. Footnote 87. Reading footnote 87. Houston, January 27, 76, page 21. Resuming the reading. The committee reviewed those proprietaries which had been sold or otherwise disposed of during the period from 1965 to 1975. It sought to discover which of those proprietaries disposed of in the last 10 years maintain a significant relationship with the agency by contract or informal understanding. More specifically, the committee sought answers to the following questions. 1. How have proprietaries been disposed of by the agency? 2. Have proprietaries or their assets been sold to persons who had previously served as directors, officers, or employees of the proprietaries? 3. How often were proprietaries sold pursuant to an agreement or understanding that the purchased proprietary would provide the agency with goods, services, or other assistance? End of page 240, beginning page 241. Our study revealed that, during the indicated period, a large number of proprietaries were dissolved, sold, or otherwise disposed of, thus substantiating the agency's claim that it had moved decisively to extricate itself from this area of activity. In a very real sense, it is nearly impossible to evaluate whether a, quote, link, end quote, still exists between the agency and a former asset related to a proprietary. In some cases, even though formal and informal agency ties are discontinued, social and interpersonal relationships remain. The impact of such liaisons is difficult to assess. At its peak, Air America, the agency's largest proprietary, had total assets of some $50 million and directly employed more than 5,000 individuals. The total number of employees for the Air America complex was in excess of 8,000. The company is in the process of being liquidated, because it is no longer required. The Air America complex included a number of other companies with the Pacific Corporation as the holding company. The general plan for liquidation of Air America is for the Pacific Corporation to sell off Air America Incorporated and its affiliates. A private New York firm was engaged to estimate a fair market value for the complex. Although the agency conducted an intensive search for competitive bidders, it was able to find buyers for only one of the affiliated companies. The sale of this company was closed on January 31st, 1975. The remaining parts of Air America are being liquidated by sale of individual assets upon completion of existing contracts. Funds realized from the sales could be as much as $25 million and will be returned to the Treasury. Agency financial support for Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, both sizable proprietaries, was terminated in FY 1971, and responsibility for their funding and operation was assumed by the Department of State. Southern Air Transport was sold on December 31st, 1973, because its contingency capability was no longer needed. The agency realized $6,470,000 from this sale, of which $3,345,000 was in cash, including a $1.2 million award in arbitration of a dispute over the proceeds of the sale of an aircraft by Southern Air Transport after the sale of the company by the agency. The purchaser paid the balance to Air America to retire a debt owed by Southern Air Transport. A group of employees of Southern Air Transport filed a civil action disputing the propriety of the sale of the company by the agency, but the case was dismissed with prejudice on July 17, 1974 by a federal court. Most of the entities which the agency has divested itself were either sold or given to witting individuals, former officers, employees, managers, contractors, etc. A handful were sold or given to witting individuals who had no formal relationship with the proprietary. In several cases, transfer of the entity was conditional as an agreement that the proprietary would continue to provide goods or services to the CIA. Other methods which have occasionally been used to dispose of entities include merger with another agency proprietary, transfer or sale of a proprietary to another government department, and liquidation with remaining assets of the proprietary being given to previously uncompensated participants in the venture or to other agency proprietaries. End of page 241, beginning page 242. Section 2. The sale of Southern Air Transport, Inc. Southern Air Transport Incorporated, SAT, is an American air carrier, incorporated in the state of Florida on October 31st, 1949. From its inception until its purchase in 1960 by the Central Intelligence Agency, it was privately owned. It was purchased by the CIA on August 5th, 1960, and owned by the CIA through December 31st, 1973, when the agency sold the firm back to one of its original owners. The decision to acquire Southern Air Transport was triggered by a change in the regulations governing the award of military air transport services, MATS, contracts. On April 1st, 1960, Air America had begun flying a 7-month MATS contract operating out of Tachikawa Air Force Base in Japan to other Pacific locations. In June of 1960, the Department of Defense and the Civil Aeronautics Board changed the regulations governing the awarding of military air transport service contracts to require that bidders hold at least a supplemental certificate of convenience and necessity for an air carrier and that they participate in the Civil Reserve Air Fleet program. Air America did not meet either of these new criteria and could not obtain appropriate waivers. The Air America heavy airlift capability represented an American asset for use in future operational contingencies throughout the Far East area. Loss of the Military Air Transport Service contract would result in underutilization of aircraft and air crews, and the revenues were needed to sustain these assets. Therefore, the CIA proposed that either Air America should obtain the necessary certification, or that the agency should buy another commercial firm that already held these certifications. The October 1st, 1960 contract date, the need for public hearings, and lengthy proceedings militated against Air America applying for the certificate. In order to avoid lengthy public hearings, which would be time-consuming and generate public exposure, it was decided that the ownership of the company to be acquired must be kept completely separate from Air America. This solution was concurred in by the CAB, DoD, the CIA, and Air America management. It was anticipated that if the new company were awarded on an ongoing military air transport service contract, it would actually perform the flying service but would use equipment under conditional sale from Air America and would employ personnel transferred from Air America. Under intercompany agreements, Air America would provide all maintenance work, ground handling, and other services for which it would be reimbursed by the new company. In this way, Air America would share in the revenues generated by Military Air Transport Service contracts. The proposal to purchase the supplemental carrier and operate it under the above arrangement was approved by Director of Central Intelligence Alan Dulles on July 15, 1960. Funds from the clandestine services budget for FY 1962 were made available for purchase. After World War II, there had been over 200 supplemental carriers in existence. By 1960, only 18 were still operating. Air America management made a survey of the 18 and determined that Southern Air Transport in Miami, Florida was the most attractive as a purchase possibility. It operated 2 C-46s, one owned, one leased, between end of page 242, beginning page 243, Miami, and points in the Caribbean and South America. Its associated company owned the 4-acre property on which SAT was located. Moreover, it operated at a modest profit and had no long-term debts. Negotiations for the purchase of SAT were successful, and on August 5, 1960, the CIA exchanged $307,506.10 for all outstanding shares of capital stock of SAT and its real estate property owning affiliate. The agency owned these shares in the name of a former board member of Air America. Under CIA management, Southern Air Transport operated with 2 semi-autonomous sections, the Pacific and Atlantic divisions. The Pacific Division performed the MATS contract and supported agency, quote, heavy lift, end quote, requirements in East Asia. The Atlantic Division continued to operate in the Caribbean and South America, doing the same sort of flying Southern Air Transport had done prior to agency acquisition. The Atlantic Division was also able to furnish support for certain sensitive operations. At the peak of its activities, the Southern Air Transport fleet comprised of both owned and leased aircraft, including Douglas DC-6, Boeing 727, and Lockheed L-100, Hercules aircraft. The sale. In 1972, it became apparent that the agency's air capabilities exceeded its needs, and that political realities and future operational requirements in the post-war era of Southeast Asia would not require large air proprietary assets. On April 21, 1972, the Director of Central Intelligence authorized the divestiture of CIA ownership and control of the Air America complex and Southern Air Transport. He approved recommendations calling for Air America to be retained until the end of the war in Southeast Asia, the immediate elimination of the Pacific Division of SAT, the sale of two 727 aircraft leased to SAT by Air America, and subsequent divestiture of agency ownership and control of the remainder of SAT. Footnote 88. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 88. The director determined that, quote, we no longer should retain air proprietaries purely for the contingent requirements, and that on the record, therefore, the agency should divest itself of the Southern Air Transport complex entirely, end quote. He stated that the desirable course of action would be dissolution, although he realized that the problems were many and complex. Also, he did not rule out other solutions which might achieve the end and yet better satisfy the interests of all concerned. Resuming the reading. Specific note was made that conflict of interest should be avoided and that no employee should receive a windfall benefit as a result of these transactions. Footnote 89. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 89. A condition imposed by the Director of Central Intelligence was that, quote, in the disposition of any of the assets involved, nothing inure to the benefit of the agency employees or former employees or persons whose relationship with the agency has been or is of such a nature as might raise a question of conflict of interest, end quote. Resuming the reading. In May 1972, two agency officials met with the chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board and his administrative assistant to seek informal advice as to the best way to disengage from Southern Air Transport. Three alternatives were discussed. 1. Dissolve the company and sell the assets. 2. Sell the assets to the current operators of the company. 3. Sell SAT or merge SAT into one of the other supplemental carriers. The CAB chairman discouraged option 3 because it would involve public hearings and would be subject to criticism by the other supplementals. Option 1, although least troublesome from the legal, end of page 243, beginning page 244, and security standpoints, would further reduce the shrinkage number of U.S. supplementals. By 1972, there were only 11 supplemental carriers left, and would be unfair to Southern Air Transport employees. The CAB officials had no objection to option 2. On May 5, 1972, the DCI was presented with the results of the meeting with the CAB chairman. He approved the recommendation to explore the sale of the equity in SAT to the current management. It was noted that SAT had been operating as a supplemental carrier for 25 years, that none of the employees of SAT had ever been an employee of the agency, and that both the Department of Defense and the chairman of the CAB considered it in their best interests to keep Southern Air Transport as a viable carrier. The rationale behind selling SAT intact to its management was 1. Liquidation would deprive the United States of a useful a useful air carrier, and would be unfair to the employees. 2. Sale of SAT on the open market would generate an unacceptable level of public interest and scrutiny. A publicly advertised disposition would run contrary to the director's statutory mandate to protect intelligence sources and methods. 3. Although a potential for conflict of interest and windfall profit existed, the sale of SAT to its management would best satisfy the requirements of everyone involved. The DCI was apparently allowed this flexibility in method of disposal by statute 40 U.S.C. 474-17 provides that nothing in the regulations relating to disposal of surplus government property shall affect any authority of the CIA. In addition, 50 U.S.C. 403-D5 provides that the Director of Central Intelligence is responsible for protecting intelligence sources and methods from unauthorized disclosure. It was determined that the sale of Southern Air Transport stock to one of its former owners in a confidential manner would prevent damage which could result from disclosure of CIA ownership. Agency officials began exploring ways in which SAT could be sold to its management without permitting a windfall to accrue to the buyer, and in a way that could not be construed as a conflict of interest. To establish a reasonable selling price, the agency asked a certified public accounting firm to perform a valuation study. The accounting firm, in turn, engaged an aviation consultant firm to conduct an evaluation of the aircraft. The following values were established. 1. Book value of Southern Air Transport, $3.900 million. 2. Estimated total value of SAT capital stock on open market, $2.645 million. 3. Disposal as going concern, $2.100 million. 4. Liquidation value, $1.250 million. 5. Agency investment, $1.500 million. Based on these figures, the executive director, comptroller, on August 17, 1972, approved an asking price of $2.7 million. Sale at this price to the management would require simultaneous payment in full of the $3.2 million note payable to Air America through an associated land holding company, and would not include any equity in the lease purchase agreement between SAT and Air America for a Lockheed L-100-330 Hercules aircraft. Although this $2.7 million price was less than the $3.9 million book value, it did exceed the fair market value of the company as calculated by professional appraisers. The appraisals were based not on depreciated purchase prices for assets, as end of page 224, beginning page 244, beginning page 245, reflected in book values, but on the earning power of the assets adjusted to, quote, present value, end quote, and the current resale value for all assets. On August 23, 1972, the former owner was advised that the asking price for SAT was $5.9 million, $2.7 million for the acquisition of stock, and $3.2 million for the payment of debt to Air America. A deadline date of October 1, 1972 was established. Otherwise, the firm would be dissolved and the assets liquidated. Although the former owner contended the asking price contended the asking price should be reduced because the outstanding loan to Air America had been reduced since the date of the study. He stated that he would attempt to work out financing within the deadline date of October 1st, 1972. This deadline was extended by the agency to December 4, 1972. On December 5th, 1972, the former owner submitted an offer to buy SAT for $5 million, $1.875 million for the acquisition of SAT, and $3.125 million to pay off the debt to Air America. On December 26, 1972, the executive director comptroller approved the recommendation that the offer be rejected, and that if the former owner was unable to raise by January 20, 1973, the additional funds required for the original purchase price of $5.9 million, including the Air America debt, that the agency proceeded with liquidation plans and the dismissal of SAT employees, was not later than February 1st, 1973. On January 11, 1973, a new proposal was submitted to purchase SAT for the total price of $5,605,000. The former owner cited a tentative commitment for a loan of $4.0 million, and his offer was contingent upon an additional loan. The offer called for a total payment of $5,605,000, broken down as follows. Acquisition of SAT stock, $2.145 million. Payment of debt to Air America, $3.125 million. Credit for payments to Air America since 10 June 1972 in liquidation of long-term debt, $0.335 million. Total payment, $5.605 million. Prior to accepting the offer, the CIA officers again discussed the sale of SAT with a CAB representative, who indicated that the board would be interested in seeing SAT continued. The CAB representative stated that it would not be necessary to surface the agency's name as the true owner of SAT in the CAB proceedings, and that he did not anticipate any problems with other supplemental carriers as a result of the sale. On January 19, 1973, the DCI approved the sale of SAT. It was noted that the offer was within 5% of the original asking price, was above the independent evaluation for sale as a going concern, and was at a figure which would not seem to give the buyer windfall profit. The sale would constitute a clean breakaway of SAT from the agency, with the exception of a 1-year extension on the lease/purchase agreement with Air America for an L-100-30 aircraft. This agreement for sale between the former owner and the agency included a provision that any profit derived from the sale of assets within 1 year would constitute a windfall and would be added to the total sale price. On February 28, 1973, the Board of Directors of SAT executed corporate action on the agreement for sale of SAT to the former owner. Closing date was established at not later than 30 days after CAB approval. On March 1, 1973, application for approval of acquisition, end of page 245, beginning page 246, of control of SAT by the former owner was filed with the CAB under docket number 252-64. It was anticipated that CAB approval would be forthcoming within 60 days. Subsequent to the agreement for sale and application to a CAB, several supplemental carriers generated a great deal of pressure to prevent SAT from being sold to the former owner and to prevent SAT from operating as a supplemental carrier. This pressure was applied through congressional representatives to the General Accounting Office and the General Services Administration. The various supplemental carriers objected to the sale of SAT for a variety of reasons. Basically, each supplemental objected to the portions of SAT's operating authority, which would allow SAT to compete with it. Specifically, representatives of one competitor indicated that it would not oppose the sale if the new owner would voluntarily renounce his rights to Trans-Pacific routes. Two other companies objected to SAT operating any aircraft as large or larger than a 727 in the Far East. Another objected to SAT bidding on any domestic MAC contracts. Restricting SAT to satisfy all potential competitors could make SAT sufficiently unattractive as a profitable investment that financing would be unobtainable. With this in mind, the agency took the position that agreement for sale of SAT had been executed, subject to CAB approval. If the CAB ruled against the sale and ownership reverted to the agency would cease any bids or service under MAC contracts and dissolve SAT. Two supplementals expressed interest in buying SAT. One did not make a cash offer, but on June 29, 1973, the other made a cash offer of about $2 million, in excess of what the former owner had offered. According to the agency, there were compelling reasons not to pursue these offers. Agency officers had reason to believe that the supplementals were not interested in actually buying SAT, as they were attempting to secure a commitment from the agency which could be used to compromise the CIA's position in future CAB hearings. Three reasons for not accepting either offer were: 1. Any merger with another supplemental carrier would necessitate a very difficult series of CAB hearings, during which all other major supplementals would certainly voice loud and strenuous objections. 2. To sell the firm on a sole source basis to either outside buyer without soliciting public bids would be contrary to sound business practice and would attract even more adverse publicity. 3. Both offers were made directly to officials of the CIA and not to the stockholders of record, although the relationship between the CIA and SAT was the subject of much public speculation. The relationship was still classified, and an acceptance of either offer would be a violation of security and cover. Dissolution of the firm or sale to the former owner continued as the most acceptable method of divestiture, subject to CAB approval. In view of the objections by other supplemental carriers to the sale of SAT to its former owner, and the award by the Air Force of a logistics air contract to SAT, the Director of Central Intelligence directed on July 31st, 1973, end of page 246, beginning page 247, that SAT be dissolved, that it withdraw from the LOGAIR, Log Air contract, and withdraw its application for renewal of supplemental certificate. The former owner was advised of this decision and made a counter-offer to purchase the company under his previous offer. He also proposed that SAT return its supplemental certificate, withdraw application for acquisition for sale from CAB, and operate as a commercial carrier under Federal Aviation Regulation Part 121 authority. Such action would remove SAT from direct competition with the supplementals, but retain a worthwhile market in which to operate. Additionally, no CAB hearing would be necessary to obtain this type of operating authority. On October 1st, 1973, the DCI agreed to entertain the proposal to continue the sale of Southern Air Transport as a Part 121 operator, on the condition that the former owner obtained prompt financing. Otherwise, the firm would be dissolved. On October 5th, 1973, the SAT Board of Directors approved and executed a new agreement for sale, including the following provisions. 1. The former owner to acquire a stock of Southern Air Transport and Actus for $2,145,000. 2. The former owner to pay off $3,125,000 owed to Air America. 3. Agreement subject to the former owner obtaining $4 million loan. 4. Agreement to be subject to Southern Air Transport withdrawing application for renewal of its certificate of necessity and convenience for an air carrier, supplemental certificate. 5. Lease/purchase agreement for L100 between AAM and Southern Air Transport to be extended 1 year. 6. Anti-windfall provision to be effective for 1 year from date of sale. On November 29, 1973, the former owner received a commitment from the First National Bank of Chicago for a loan of $4.5 million, thereby making the October 5, 1973 agreement operative. On November 30, 1973, the Director of Central Intelligence approved the sale of Southern Air Transport in accordance with the October 5th agreement for sale. On the same day, the application to the CAB for acquisition of Southern Air Transport under docket number 252-64 was withdrawn, and petition for cancellation of certificate and termination of exemption authority was filed with an effective date of December 30, 1973. On December 31st, 1973, the sale was closed, the note to Air America was paid off, and the former owner became the sole owner of Southern Air Transport. In early January 1974, CIA officials learned from Air America management that Southern Air Transport had exercised the purchase option of the lease/purchase agreement between Southern Air Transport and Air America for the Lockheed L-100-30 Hercules aircraft. The option sale price from Air America was $3,150,000. Southern Air Transport immediately resold the aircraft to Saturn Airways for $4,350,000 for a profit of $1.2 million. The agency interpreted this sale as a violation of the anti-windfall provisions of its agreement with the owner. On January 25, 1974, Air America executed an escrow and arbitration agreement on behalf of the CIA with Southern Air Transport on the dispute $1.2 million profit. The agreement called for $750,000 to be placed in escrow with the American Security and Trust Company of Washington, D.C. The escrow funds were to be held as a certificate of deposit purchased at the prevailing market. End of page 247, beginning page 248. Market rate. It was further agreed that Southern Air Transport would also place in escrow a promissory note to Air America for the remaining $450,000 of the disputed amount. The note was to bear interest at the same rate currently being earned on the certificate of deposit in escrow. It was arranged that the escrow deposits plus accrued interest would be paid to the party deemed in favor by an arbiter, with each party to pay one half of the costs of arbitration. On September 5th, 1974, the arbitrator ruled in favor of Air America. This decision caused an additional $1,304,243 to accrue to the agency from the Southern Air Transport sale. This was the sum of the $1.2 million under arbitration, plus accrued interest, less the agency's share of arbitration costs. Section 3. Declassification of relationship with CIA. In March 1974, the employees of Southern Air Transport retained an attorney and brought a class action suit in U.S. District Court for Southern Florida against Southern Air Transport, Inc., and the Central Intelligence Agency. The employees, as plaintiffs, sued for injunctive relief and damages. In this suit, the employees alleged 1. That the CIA sold the stock of Southern Air Transport to the former owner illegally. 2. That Southern Air Transport had embarked on a program to sell off its assets, depriving the plaintiffs of employment. 3. That the plaintiffs were entitled to the benefits of the CIA retirement and disability system. And 4. That their civil rights had been violated. In view of the publicity arising from the allegations made by other supplemental carriers during the CAB proceedings and the publicity arising from this suit, it was determined that no useful purpose would be served by continuing to deny the true ownership relationship of Southern Air Transport by the CIA. The operational activities performed by Southern Air Transport on behalf of CIA were and remain classified. As a part of the agency's defense in this suit, an affidavit of the Deputy Director for Management and Services of the CIA were presented in court. In the affidavit, he delineated the relationship between the CIA and Southern Air Transport and the authorities for purchasing and later selling the capital stock of Southern Air Transport. He also defined the employment status of the plaintiffs as not being government employees and not being CIA employees, and therefore not being eligible for participation in the CIA retirement and disability system. In the order granting motion for summary judgment, the court found that the sale of the Southern Air Transport capital stock was not in violation of the law, that the plaintiffs claimed to be U.S. government employees and entitled to CIA retirement benefits was invalid, and that the Southern Air Transport employees were not deprived of any civil right under any state law. As a result, the action was dismissed with prejudice as to the plaintiff. Although this suit did cause the relationship between the agency and Southern Air Transport to be officially disclosed, it did establish in a court of law 2 points favorable to the agency. A. The sale of Southern Air Transport violated no laws and was within the authority of the Director of Central Intelligence, and the directly hired employees of CIA-owned proprietary firms, such as Southern Air Transport, do not necessarily enjoy the status of federal government employees. End of page 248, beginning page 249. Section 4. Possible conflict of interest. In the Southern Air Transport divestiture, the agency took precautions to avoid conflict of interest. A retired staff agent who had been the managing director of Air America, Inc., made several offers to acquire Southern Air Transport. In early 1972, he and some other members of Air America management made an informal offer to buy Southern Air Transport. On August 7, 1972, the retired staff agent told the agency official responsible for the management of Southern Air Transport and Air America that he, in association with two supplementals, wanted to offer, quote, book value, end quote, for Southern Air Transport. He stated that they were not interested in Southern Air Transport's certificate, but rather in the equipment, and that if allowed to make an offer, it would be one that would not require CAB hearings. In both cases, the CIA General Counsel determined that due to the offerer's close association with the agency, the offer was unacceptable. In later discussions, the retired staff agent asked to be allowed to bid on Southern Air Transport in open bidding. The General Counsel's position on this request was that open bids would not solve the conflict of interest problems. In any transaction this complex, selecting the bid is only a preliminary to the negotiated final sale. Another potential conflict of interest involved another supplemental air carrier. From the time the agency first decided to divest until the sale was consummated, this company expressed continuing interest in merging with SAT. Their representative was a former director of Central Intelligence who made literally dozens of phone calls to agency officials and arranged many meetings, all for the purpose of presenting this company's case to purchase Southern Air Transport. The company also proposed to arrange, quote, shadow financing, end quote, of the former owner of Southern Air Transport, if he would agree to merge at some later time. These offers were all rejected because merger with another supplemental was not an acceptable solution and the apparent conflict of interest was too great. The sale of Southern Air Transport to its former owner was another area of possible conflict of interest. While the former owner was not an employee of the federal government during any period of association with Southern Air Transport, or CIA, he had been the owner prior to CIA acquisition and had been nominal president of Southern Air Transport during agency ownership. This potential area of conflict had been recognized at the outset of the sale proceedings, and the agency obtained third-party professional evaluation and restricted windfall profits to prevent such conflicts. The underlying philosophy for the sale back to the former owner was to restore the status quo ante, i.e., return of the corporation to its previous ownership once the need for a government-controlled entity had terminated. Section E, financial aspect. And actually, I'm going to stop here for this recording.